So I'm going to do a little bit of background about me so you know where I've come from, but I might not use the PowerPoint at all. We'll probably just use the whiteboard. But we'll see if we can find some pretty pictures. So I work as a senior clinical lecturer at the University of Otago at Christchurch School of Medicine, and help to found the Collaborative Trust, which does research and training into youth health and development. Oh, and this is a commercial ad break at the beginning, you'll get one at the end. No, the Collaborative put together this manual, which is based on research done in Aussie, in fact. They very kindly let us use it as a kind of basis. So we've Kiwiized it, felt like rewriting it to be honest. And we're, some of the websites and things are a bit out of date now, so we've reduced the price and we're selling it at $20. So if anybody would like to purchase one for their practice, come and see me at lunchtime. And I've given out, some of you have had, this is based on our research that we did with young people in North Canterbury schools. And some of them in youth justice residents. So it's just some comments from young people about how they would like their health practitioners to work with them. So hopefully you find that useful. If you haven't got one, and because you came after I gave them out, then let me know. So that's the Collaborative, and that's our website somewhere, www.collaborative.org.nz, so you can find out more about us there. I also work at a youth one-stop shop. Anybody know of a youth one-stop shop in their area? Yep. So you've got Number 10 in Invercargill. You've got Evolve in Wellington. There's Vibe in Lower Hutt and Upper Hutt. There's KISS on Kapiti Coast. There's YOS in Palmerston North. There's Youth Services Trust in Whanganui. There's 298 in Christchurch. There's a long story about why it's called 298, but we'll go to that maybe if there's time. There's Number 10 in Invercargill. There's Youth Wellbeing Trust in Dunedin, but it's less of a one-stop shop because it hasn't got health added. There used to be one in Taranaki, but that's closed. There's one being developed in Nelson, Stoke. There's one being developed in Westport and in Timaru, and there's one in Auckland called Health West. It's called Youth Health Hub. And yeah, so there's quite a few around the place. So really, I'm saying that because I really encourage you to get in touch with your nearby Youth One-Stop Shop in terms of ongoing tips and things. And I like wearing t-shirts that give you a visual image as well. So if you want to know more, hang on a minute. If you want to know more, join SAIPANS, which is the Society for Youth Health Practitioners Aotearoa New Zealand, which will give you lots more information and updates and training opportunities. We're hoping in Christchurch actually to go further with the Youth One-Stop Shop and to create a hub of organisations working together that cover things like employment agency, housing, transition housing, as well as activities and things to do, not just health. So that's where I'm at the moment. So let me just think, what do you think, we'll come back to that. Let's get some information from you. What do you think are the most important people in, well, first of all, how do we define youth? How do we define youth? What kind of, fast readers will have seen the slide. How do we define this age group between children and adolescents, or children and adults? What markers of you defining? You know, you're a hospital manager trying to decide who should go where. How do we define this group? What criteria do we use? Age, okay, so we can define them chronologically. And so if you define them chronologically, what age does childhood end and what age does adulthood begin? We've got 13, any other offers? 15, any other offers? 12, any other offers? 10, any other offers? Okay, we'll come back to that. When does adulthood begin? 25, 20, 40, 22, 21, 18. So it's a very variable feast, isn't it? And actually, that's probably good, because how else could you define it apart from age? Development. So I'd like to call that physiological definition. So if you go by physiological development, when would a child begin?
Puberty.
Sorry, end. Puberty. Puberty, yeah. So that's easy marker, isn't it? How long does puberty take?
5 years.
Yeah, 2 or 3 probably, from the beginning of adrenarche, so the beginning of hormone production, through to being a biologically reproductive adult, probably about 2 or 3 years, sometimes a bit longer. What's the youngest age you can possibly have a period? So it's easy for girls, as that's the good marker. But actually, puberty starts before the first period. So what's the youngest age that can be without it being a disease?
It's about 9 or 10.
It's probably 8. And what's the oldest age it can begin without it being a disease? 16. And girls start earlier than boys. So some boys could be just starting puberty at 16, so they won't actually end puberty till about 19. What's the adulthood marker, if you like, of physiological development? When is your physiological development finished to mark you as an adult? What would? No, not age, the marker.
Brain maturity.
Brain maturity, yep. And what's the last bit to develop brain-wise? Prefrontal lobes, I say. So, and that's pretty hard because there's not much of a marker for that, is there? I mean, I'm sure not in my lifetime, maybe in our lovely TI's lifetime, we're all going to have pocket, scanners, and we're going to be able to go, yeah, you've got a way to go. You're just about there. You're not quite, and it'll be so much easier, won't it? Be great. But at the moment, we can only guess at this, but I'm hoping to help you kind of see how you can guess at some of the stuff. Okay, how else could you mark it?
Life events.
Life events, yeah. So can I put that down as social development? Because in the Western world, how long does adolescence last? 20 years, 30, yeah. If you take the life event as employment, sometimes never. But in some cultures, of course, it's 2 seconds. You're a child, you jump off a bridge, or you have some sort of ceremony, and you're an adult. Nothing like what we have. So, what social events would you like to go by?
Leaving home.
Okay, so if you leave home at 14, are you an adult? Okay, so we can put leaving home somewhere around adulthood. Does that mark an adult? I left home when I was 9. I went to boarding school in England.
If you're the independent youth benefit, 1 to 2 years, adult to some degree.
Okay, so being on the IYB, all right.
Rites of passage, like learning.
Yeah. So, so a rite of passage may be declaring you as an adult. Yep. What's our rite of passage that declares us as adults in New Zealand?
Voting.
Driving license. Okay. 21st. Vote. So some of those are actually determined by law, aren't they? So that's another way of defining. And this age group has more laws around restricting behaviour than people in prison. What's the oldest age where a law defines your behaviour or defines your ability to do something? 25 for car insurance. But there's lots of things, and again, it's graduated, which is quite good, because when you think about physiological development, it's graduated, isn't it? How long does brain development take, do you think? It takes about 10 years, probably, and it probably starts, we think it's initiated by the hormone stuff. We're not sure, but we think. And one of the pretty pictures that shows that, actually, we'll come back to that one. I'll show you some pretty pictures in a minute. But a lot of it is culturally defined, isn't it? And we often, European New Zealanders tend to say, culture's for Māori, that's the Māori stuff. But actually we all have a culture. And some of it is formed by things like this, isn't it? Jasmine was in a relationship with a dirty homeless boy named Aladdin. Snow White lived with 7 men. Pinocchio was a liar. Robin Hood was a thief. Tarzan walked around with no clothes on. A stranger kissed Sleeping Beauty and she married him. Cinderella lied and snuck out at night to attend a party. You can't blame us, we were taught to rebel since a young age. But it's part of our culture, isn't it? So we need to remember that. So just let's talk to your neighbour, just to get you into mood of kind of, because you know we tend to go by age. The United Nations, WHO, say that actually adolescence is from 10 to 24, because they try and take into account early puberty, obviously not as early, but fairly early, and go up to average age for prefrontal lobe connection. You know, but some people, if they started puberty at 16, they may not get prefrontal lobe connection until 26, 27, 28. Boys start later than girls. So that's their definition chronologically. Okay, so just think about when you were, let's say 15 as a kind of midpoint, mid-brain development, what impact did your parents, your school and your community have on you? Because I think you'll agree that's the environments in which young people grow up in. And what's the difference between then and now? Some of you will have to remember this far harder than others. Okay, so just talk to your neighbour. Anybody want to share what they came up with?
Corporal punishment.
So that's changed from between then and now?
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, just the treat that made you behave more.
It might have made you behave more, but others I don't think it did.
In technology.
Yeah, that's the big difference, isn't it? Yeah. Well, we'll talk a bit more about that, but maybe now's a good time, because in fact it's really interesting. I'd heard the internet guy Joel Parsons. If you ever he comes to your place, have a listen. He's really good. But his principle is, and I totally agree with him, the internet is actually the same basic principles of communication are exactly the same whether it's face-to-face or internet. Internet speeds it up. And also, the trouble with internet is that it tends to be, you miss out on the body language and the tone of voice. So whether it speeds up communication, perhaps that's a good thing, or whether it slows down communication because you're not getting the nuances, there's pros and cons. And there's some really good things about the internet, and there's some really terrible things about the internet, just like cars, nuclear power, you know, all the stuff that we have to deal with every day. And for me, the problem is not the internet. For me, the problem is us adjusting to that different way of communication. And so, obviously, the younger you are, you've grown up with it, so it's no adjustment, just there. Whereas for us, well, I'm putting myself, but maybe there's some others who grew up with technology, we're having to adjust to this different way of communicating. But actually, the principles are the same. And what actually Joel Parsons tends to say is, in terms of parents helping young people, you need to use the same values and help them to learn the same values about communication, whether it be via internet or face-to-face. The worry is the growth of social phobias and that whole anxiety stuff around meeting people face-to-face. Some young people tell me, though, it's so helpful because you don't feel so alone. You learn about other cultures. You communicate with different religious people. You know, so there's way more broader interaction than your village and the people you grew up with. But now the issue is that kind of non-verbal communication growth, which, or lack of, which is kind of making it difficult when you come to face-to-face stuff. So there's some really good things, but there's some not such good things. And I think if we treat it just as another method of communication, but use it to encourage face-to-face stuff. So really interesting, my granddaughter is on this thing where you can earn badges. Just like, guess what? Girl Guides and Brownies, but it's on the net. But they encourage you to go and find other people who are doing the badge as well, and do it together face-to-face as well as online. Now that seems to me a really good use of technology. So there's ways we need to learn how to use it. Not be afraid of it, but learn how to use it. and therefore encourage young people to use it in order to get more face-to-face rather than instead of. So I'm going to leave it there, but happy to any questions around that in terms of technology stuff? I think if we use those basic principles, I think you can't go too far wrong. But then I think it's important to encourage parents to learn, to be up to date with how to use the technology, because really it's just a question of learning. And therefore they can kind of keep their eye on what the kids are doing, just like you would in terms of watching television or in terms of doing any other activity that could possibly be harmful, just the same way. But there's also great advantages.
And if you were asked about the amount of time that, young person should spend on technology.
I think it's just the same as the amount of time just same. If you're in a corner with a book the whole day, you're not getting enough exercise. It's just the same whether it be screen time or a book, or an obsessive working of a board game, or a video game. There's really no difference. But it's around actually trying to encourage young people to have a balanced life. And that's always been hard, because you get interested in something, you get into it and you get good at it, so you don't want to do anything else. But I think that's the skill for parents, really hard to do, is to say, no, you need to do this now. And the other thing I really encourage parents to do is say, plug in time, including yourself. So you can't say to kids, you've got to plug in and switch off stuff if you take yours to bed. One of my gurus in adolescent health is David Bennett, who's an adolescent health physician in Australia. And he wrote a book on bringing up teenagers. And then his son got up at one meeting and said, now I'm going to tell you about my father, the hypocrite. Because it's very easy to tell people what to do and not easy to do it yourself. So I think as parents, we have to be role models. And if we're going to say you have to plug in before you go to bed, then we have to do it too. So I was talking to some parents the other day, and this gorgeous woman from Ireland said, in Ireland now, the social more is everybody plugs in. Everybody plugs in at 9 or whatever time you agree on as a family, and everybody plugs in. I thought, isn't that great? Because we worry about cyberbullying and the fact that bullying now is 24/7 and goes everywhere with you. Switch off. Then it won't go with you. Simple as that. And as parents, we have to say, switch off. As people helping parents, we have to encourage them to say, switch off. And we have to do it ourselves. And that's really hard to do. I'm the world's worst, hopeless. So I think, does that help in terms of guide for that? Cool. Okay, so anybody else want to share any differences between then and now? That's usually the main thing that comes up. Anybody else got some?
There's a lot more openness with gender issues and sexuality than what before it was swept under the rug or in the closet, so to speak. And I do find there's a lot more. When I perceive it as the kids feel pressured to sort of give themselves a name in terms of their sexuality. Like even had a 13-year-old come and say to me that she's bi and other stuff like that. When it's a lot more open experimentation, and I do have some parents, and even myself sometimes have kind of difficulty with, you're so young, but you say you're doing this. And some of it is facilitated as well. Yeah.
Well, in a minute we'll do a bit on brain development, and we'll talk a bit about identity development.
I actually think it's the opposite. I think there was a period when you had to put a label on everything, and now I just get the opposite idea that it's just more fluid and just easier to identify as one or the other, but without the pressure of having to put a name on it. I think that's it.
Yep. We'll talk about spectrums. Life's a rainbow. Cool. Okay, thank you. So I'm just going to talk a bit about development now. So, we've talked about kind of how you stage it, but it really is the time when the tooth fairy stops coming and the acne fairy arrives. So it's a developmental period. I think we can all agree on that. And as I say, I like to think about physiological development. There's also social development, cultural development, spiritual development. There's tons of different developments. So we need to take them all into account. And it's about becoming an adult. So the brain has to change. Obviously, physical change is happening. My grandson is going through this at the moment. Have you noticed how they have such big feet? Huge. And totally out of proportion with their bodies, a bit like babies have heads that are totally out of proportion with their bodies. So bodies changing in ways that are hard to understand. But there's tons of changes going on. You know, it's no wonder they're all so tired. I listened to a gynecologist once, and she talked about the level of hormones being at a disease state for any other age. Because they're all so up and down, everything's happening at once, but all at different stages and different ways. And that's what I want to stress, they're all different. So in terms of brain development, alongside sexual development, and this is Peter Gluckman's work. Don't ask me how they decided 20,000 years ago that puberty was around 13 or 11, 12 rather, 10, 11, 12. But I think they do it by carbon dating and bone fusion and that kind of stuff. But you can see that as, you know, humans have evolved, in fact, puberty has evolved quite well with social mores in a way. And it's easy to look back, but at the time probably there were some big adjustments going on. But why do you think puberty went up in those times? Why did it happen at a later stage in terms of chronological age? Food intake, absolutely. So these people were living at a time, so here, plentiful food supply. Not many people to share it with, plentiful food supply. Here, people came together in groups, agriculture took place, so more people to share the food with, and, you know, weather controlled, all that kind of stuff. And then here, even less food, urban dwellings, socioeconomic stuff going on. And now it's come down again to what probably is normal for our species. It's probably nothing to do with hormones in the chickens or absent fathers. It's probably what's normal for our species with lots of food around. But there's this mismatch, because here, about puberty, what were you doing in industrial times a couple of hundred years ago? Working, yeah. Here, what were we doing? Playing Xbox, sitting down, shut up, learn, listen and learn, yeah? Not doing much. So there's this mismatch before we're allowed to be an adult between our body being adults and when we're allowed to be an adult socially. But that may be a good thing, because when you think about brain development happening after, so has everybody seen these MRI scans? Okay, so this is an average 5-year-old, average 20 to 25-year-old. What's the difference? The colour? Nice observation skills, love it. Not much difference in size? Not as perspective. But really there isn't much difference in size. Most of the growing happens in the first 3 years of life. It has to grow a bit in the first 3 years of life, otherwise women will walk around like this because their heads, the head will be too big to go through. It does grow a bit in the first 3 years, but really after that there's not much. But what's the blue stuff? So it's actually white matter. Basically what happens is that the connections between the brain happen, and the blue stuff is myelin. And myelin is what covers the nerves as they start carrying current. Any electricians here or married to electricians? No, shame, because they would know all about it, because you have to cover those wires, insulate them. So that's all that is. So what changes need to occur in the brain? So you're a 5-year-old. You're going to the zoo. What are you thinking about? Running off? Ice cream. Might be thinking, oh, perhaps I'll be there in time to feed the animals.
Not really planning ahead at all.
Not at all, yeah. What about you're a parent or an uncle or an aunt or a grandparent and you're taking the 5-year-old to the zoo? What are you thinking about?
Money.
Why don't I sit wine here?
Well, do I take, suntan lotion, Mac and umbrella, food, water, a jersey, yeah? So your brain has to develop. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to be a functioning parent, and the species will die out. Yeah? So it changes in lots of different ways. This is my handy model of brain development, so bear with me. I'm determined to get the whole world to use this. So this is from Daniel Siegel. I pinched it. He's a neuropsychiatrist in the States. So it's really useful, I find, to explain it to young people themselves, but especially to parents, so they understand what's going on. So this is your spinal cord, taking messages to the body and bringing them back up. Base of your brain, automatic nervous system is what I call it, controls your organs without having to think. And your flight, or freeze reaction, noradrenaline, adrenaline, cortisol production. So that is online functioning when you're born, but very little else. We're pretty useless as a species. Some of us can't even suck. Then, first 3 years of life, we watch them, don't we? Learn to walk, talk, and chew gum at the same time. It's miraculous. And that's all that base of the brain bit coming online, starting to function. Then teenage time is coming online is the limbic system, right tucked in the middle of your brain, with hippocampus, amygdala, new ways of laying down memory, fight, flight, or freeze reaction, kind of awareness of threat and danger, really coming online at teenage times. And then the rest of the cortex wrapping round, which is that blue stuff, coming online and starting to get connected around puberty, as you can see from these ones. So, this is about 15. That's starting to blow up. Okay, so probably after puberty in terms of physical change. So those things are really coming online. So lots of experiments with functional MRI scanning to show that when you give a whole group of, they gave a whole group of teenagers different faces to look at, different emotions. You've seen all those charts for different emotions on. And then they gave it to a whole group of adults. Which bit of the brain do you think lit up for adults? Prefrontal cortex, yeah. Which bit of the brain lit up for adolescents, for teenagers? The amygdala. They think with their emotions. Okay? So just to let you know what that's like, anybody lost their keys or already late for work?
Every day.
Every day. How many times do you look in the same place?
Every day.
5, 10, 15. You have flipped your lid. You are no longer thinking with your prefrontal cortex, you're thinking with your emotions. Yeah? That's what it's like for teenagers about 80% of the time. So what do you feel like doing to the person who says, now look, just calm down? Now, come on, think. Where did you last have them? What do you want to do to them? That's how teenagers feel when we do that to them. And we do that to them all the time, don't we? So if you want to communicate with teenagers, rule number 1 is talk to the thumb. Validate the emotion first. Okay, because if you don't validate that emotion, they will not hear you, just like you didn't hear the person who says, calm down, and where did you last see them? Yeah, so what you do is, oh, that's terrible, you've lost your keys. Oh no, what shall we do? Oh, that's awful. When did you last have them? So you're acknowledging the emotion, and you're introducing the logical thought and trying to get those, connections lit up. Okay, that's really important because if you don't validate that emotion, they will just ignore you and they'll go, oh, another boring adult who doesn't understand. So really important to validate that emotion. So with anxious young people especially, acknowledge that they're anxious. Don't try and say, oh, well, don't worry, you've got nothing to worry about. They're anxious, acknowledge it, and then you can move on. Okay, so this is Perry's model, which kind of talks about the brain developing from the bottom up, just like the handy model, really. I like to use this one to show that if this is firing off a lot, this doesn't occur. So we actually probably should have started this workshop with a bit of so I know nothing about Tai Chi, but the only move I've learned is you go. So we can all do that, just be careful not to bash anybody else. Doesn't that feel good?
It feels fun.
Yeah, feel so much more relaxed. I learned from a counsellor I worked with ages ago, you can't have a panic attack with your shoulders down. It's really useful. And that breathing out, do you know what that breathing out does into your brain? It helps make GABA, GABA-aminobutyric acid. And that's really important for calming the brain. Alcohol stimulates the production of it as well. But you know, breathing out. So who's been to a counsellor? What do counsellors always say? Breathe. And it's the breathing out. That's my theory of actually why cigarette smoking is useful. Because what do people say when they smoke cigarettes? You ask them, why do you smoke? What do they say? Calm down. Yep. Yeah, actually probably nicotine actually does stimulate a bit of dopamine, which probably makes you feel better. But also, what do you do when you're smoking? So we just give somebody something to suck on and go, it's much better for them. This is all coming on in teenage times, okay? This is all coming online. So this is I like this handy model because the brain's tipped forward a bit. So your prefrontal cortex is actually your stress control center. So it's the bit that regulates the emotions and the doing. So it calms down the emotional amygdala stuff, and it helps you not to produce so much noradrenaline, so you don't get that vicious feedback stuff. So it's really important to get this online as soon as we can. How do you think we can encourage that to come online? What encourages that to come online? Practice, absolutely. What do you need? What you need experience, you need opportunities, don't you? So, you know, what gets me is when adults say, oh, isn't Lord amazing? 16 and she wrote that song, or somebody else has done things early. Actually, they can all do that if they're given the opportunity. Every single one of them. Apart from genetic problems and, you know, congenital defects and learning things. But at the same time, actually, if you get the opportunity, anybody can learn. Some people it takes longer than others. So opportunity is the most important thing for brain development. So we need to give young people opportunities to learn how to use their prefrontal cortex, because the more you use it, the more it works more efficiently. And Linda's come in to say that it's morning tea time. So just to finish that off, they're predisposed to anxiety. What's the role of a teenager in caveman times? So mums actually looked after kids. Dads went out hunting foods. What was the teenage job? Help look after the kids, but actually their job was to stay awake all night and keep the fire going to ward off the danger from rampaging wild animals. So that's why their clocks are a little bit displaced, their biological clocks. I'm not sure if that's why, but it's nice to think that, isn't it? Because we know it's a fact, their clocks are different. You know, their diurnal rhythm is an hour later than adults. And who knows? I think it's very, very logical, actually, to think this is why, when you think about evolution. Because evolution doesn't take, you know, it takes forever. And we haven't actually progressed much further from caveman days, to be quite honest. So they're geared to sense emotions and danger. So no wonder they're also anxious, especially when we speeded everything up and there's so much demands on them. So it doesn't surprise me that they're all anxious. In a way, it's part of development. Because what's the biggest risk you take in your life? Or two big risks? Two big risks that you take in your life. The big challenges in life. Leaving home. And finding a partner. Yeah? Huge risk. Yeah? So if you didn't sense, and when do we expect people to do that? Part of this development stuff. And actually, if you don't do it then, my eldest was, when he was 16, said, I'm leaving home. So I said, great, okay, let's get the paper and we'll find out what the flats are and what they cost and all this stuff. And I did such a good job, he didn't leave till he was 40. Well, a bit older, a bit younger than that, but it was quite a long time. Having said that, he was at university, did a PhD, and we lived near the university, so why would you leave home? But he got really anxious about it because he wasn't geared for it. So I think it's really important actually we encourage people to take those 2 big risks fairly early on, because that's when their brains are geared for it. Okay, so just a quick challenges, well, then we'll stop for morning tea. Anybody remember feeling like this? If only I could accept that I can't accept being someone who finds it hard to accept acceptance from those who accept me for the person I can't accept I really am. Oh, it's horrible. I remember feeling like it's just terrible. I'd never be back there. Yeah, especially teenage girls. They're so intense, aren't they? Those friendships, and they're so catty and bitchy and horrible. Yeah, it's so intense. As Lynn alluded to, we wish there was a drug to fix it. I always knew adolescence was a disease. It's a bit like menopause and premenstrual syndrome and pregnancy and being a woman, really. It's a disease that we could fix if we gave them more dopamine. Actually, there's lots of dopamine around, but there's not enough receptors, because the receptors are all being rearranged in that whole brain development stuff. So they're looking for, people talk about risk-taking versus sensation-seeking. And sensation-seeking is probably normal in terms of doing stuff with the dopamine, whereas risk-taking may well be determined by other factors. So GABA we've talked about, frontal lobe disconnection we've talked about. There's an overload of oxytocin. Oxytocin rises in 3 stages in life: at birth, teenage time, and breastfeeding. Why would that be? What's oxytocin do? Hormonal, yeah. What does it do? Sorry?
It alters the equilibrium.
Yeah. In what?
Hormones.
Yeah. In what? And what's the result in terms of behaviour?
Psychobonding.
It's about bonding. It's about bonding. Some people call it the love hormone. It goes up in breastfeeding. It's about the bonding. It also helps breast milk production. What's the job of a teenager, evolution-wise, biologically? Look for a mate and procreate. Otherwise, the species will die out. Of course, now we tell them they're not allowed to procreate. They have to wait till they're 30 and they're nearly infertile, and then they can. We live in a mad world, don't we? But this is the time. They're looking for a mate. Yeah, the bonding. Some people say, that's why there's peer pressure. Their oxytocin's going up. I'm not quite sure if you can say that, but it's nice to think that way, isn't it? Oh, it's all right, dear. It's just your oxytocin. Sex hormones obviously all over the place, and they're all happening at different times. So brain development is really tricky. So it's no wonder this stage of life is tricky, because they're adapting, flexible, but it's brilliant because they are so adaptable and flexible. It's great working with this age group. Just this is a really good example of brain development out of control in terms of physical bodies, no brain control, if you like, prefrontal cortex, especially for boys. So injury rate, chung, and then comes down again as the prefrontal cortex links in. Isn't that a beautiful picture? Got to get that linked in faster if we're going to avoid avoidable deaths.